Good evening and welcome to Planet Action today, Monday, the 21st day of November 2022. It is 2 days. Today is the third day as curtains closed on COP27 conference in Egypt. What follows after that process is taking stock of what was agreed upon. Just what does this mean moving forward, and what are the strategies that have been put in place to ensure that the recommendations and agreements have been met? My name is Dennis Assetto. With these continuous coverage on Planet Action beyond COP27, I will be having a discussion in a few on the details arrived at in Egypt. But before that now, the climate conference may have ended in Egypt on a stalemate due to responsibility and financing as African countries called for more action. But right here in Kenya, youth and women groups and in Taita Taveta have begun mass tree planting exercises, targeting to plant 500,000 indigenous trees in all the 68 forests in that county. As Ron Kimari covered this for us.
Have this piece of land, plant maybe this type of tree, a cash tree, maybe macadamia or avocado. Looking at maybe an example of macadamia, you can plant maybe an acre can accommodate around 70 macadamia trees, isn't it? These 70 macadamia trees can give you maybe, once they mature, around 100 kgs per tree. 100 kgs per tree times the 70 trees, you have 7,000 kilos of macadamia.
Tunaomba serikali ya county government ipate kusaidia in that area in allocating money and budget, especially kusaidia our community forest association members. And then kitu ingine, the MCAs should come up with the legislation kwa county assembly, sheria ambazo zinalenga kuhifadhi mazingira. Kwa sababu hii hatufanyi kwetu sisi kutufaidi. Tunafanya hivi kusaidia our future generation, watoto wetu na watoto wetu.
And this initiative is actually to bring in all the young people to come in and build up the environment, because given that the population of the youth in the world, in Africa we have the largest number of youth than any other continent in the world. So bring out in the youth in this initiative gives them the hope for the future, for tomorrow. So this initiative is basically for the building the future, tomorrow's future, and the youth will be the drivers of this initiative.
Now, a lot more needs to be done in order to save the world from the catastrophes that continue to be witnessed. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, upon conclusion of COP27, says that while an agreement on loss and damages was arrived at, a roadmap towards funding developing nations and limiting emissions isn't clear. He says we must all not lose focus on the big picture because the world depends on our actions.
Justice should also mean several other things. Finally making good on the long-delayed promise of $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries. Clarity and a credible roadmap to double adaptation finance. Changing the business models of multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. They must accept more risk and systematically leverage private finance for developing countries at reasonable costs. Our planet is still in the emergency room. We need to drastically reduce emissions now, and this is an issue this COP did not address. A fund for loss and damage is essential, but it's not an answer if the climate crisis washes a small island state off the map or turns an entire African country to desert. The red line we must not cross is the line that takes our planet over the 1.5-degree temperature limit. To have any hope of keeping to 1.5, we need to massively invest in renewables and end our addiction to fossil fuels.
Now, the COP27 conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, has come to a close. Countries, stakeholders and negotiators now start to interrogate the agreements they appended their signatures on in Egypt. But just what are some of the contentious issues that nations had a difficult time agreeing on? And what are the targets for the world in a concerted effort to make this world a better place? I am having this conversation with Kaluki Paul Mutuku, Executive Director, Kenya Environment Action Network. Paul, welcome to Planet Action.
Thank you, Dennis.
You just jetted from Egypt today.
yesterday.
Thank you for honoring this invite. But now let's talk about the meeting in Egypt. Loss and damage was huge. That had been pushed to 2024. But then again, an agreement was agreed that now there's gonna be a funding towards the same. What led the negotiators to decide that we're gonna push this to 2024, then turn back and decide that there is a funding for it?
Thank you, Dennis, and nice to have this platform. I think number one, I start by saying that it's always been obvious that the world needs loss and damage finance, and we need it now because, as you see across Africa and many other developing countries in the world, the impacts and the effects of climate change are happening in the moment. So we cannot wait to procrastinate or push the climate financing that is needed to help these communities adapt and raise resiliency to the impact of the climate crisis. So for me, I think from the onset, the COP27 presidency had made it clear that this must be the COP of implementation. And for sure, I do believe that we have delivered it, and the implementation means us setting the loss and damage fund. Much as the funding is not there, but the fund is there. So now it's a question of now, how do we fill in this pot, and how do we work to ensure that the funds come down to the grassroots and the communities who are most impacted by the effects of the climate crisis.
And you see, even when we talk about funds being there, if we go back to Paris Agreement, no, let's even go further back to Kyoto Protocol, then come to Paris Agreement, let's go to Glasgow Summit. And all these conversations about funding $100 billion per year has never been met. As we leave COP right now, what guarantees do we have that this funding is going to be met, given the fact that the agreements are not legally binding?
Yeah, and I think that's a bigger question we need to ask, but I also think it's a responsibility of those of us from the Global South to actually, through our negotiators, to keep pushing and tracking down some of these commitments. Of course, you mentioned the $100 billion climate finance, pledged annually. Last year, we had the deforestation pledge, around 19.2 billion to reverse, deforestation. But now, where is that money? Right now, we're talking about Denmark being the first country to actually pledge around 100 million kroners to loss and damage facility. That's just one country that has pledged but not actually given the money. So what do we do? I think for us, through our finance sectors in our countries and the region, we need to then have our negotiators follow through the process and our finance people to ensure that we actually have a proper plan to see the implementation. And finally, I'll say that through the adopted agenda and the text, we actually see that the presidency is recommending at least 3 key meetings to take place across 2023 to ensure that actually the mechanism is set in place and we understand how to reach out to the people that we need to finance the fund from both private and private sector, the global banks that need to support this fund. And I believe perhaps it could be one of the most opt-for fund that we have in the world, and the one that actually the Global North commits to support Global South countries to really then build resiliency and adaptation around climate crisis.
Now, when we talk about funding, that is to help deal with the loss and damages now. But we can't talk about funding that if we are still contributing in destroying the world we live in. So here comes to the fact on emissions. We know how difficult, like even as we speak right now, there has not been an agreement on limiting emissions towards the 1.5 degrees pre-industrial level. Here we talk about developing nations not agreeing on limiting their emissions. What exactly are we doing if you're not taking care of the problem that has gotten us here thus far?
I mean, again, another very key one, and we'll also realize or notice the incoming presidency of COP28 also arguing and pushing for the removal of any coal-based fossil fuels tax on the main text. So I think for me it's a question of how do we balance between development and like environmental conservation. And of course we've seen the path that the developed world use, right? We got rich, or they got rich off of exploiting fossil fuels. But we now know better that fossil fuels are the hell that we are living in, and right now they are paying a big debt. But even us in the developing world are paying the worst, right? That we never contributed to this. So why should we pay for this? So I think for me, African leaders and developing world need to also have this bit of deeper introspection. Is it the path we want to take? Is it on one side that when it fits us, we call for loss and damage, and on the other side we are literally ripping off our very remaining sense of humanity. So I think it's a bigger question for us that we have to answer as a country. We've also seen in Kenya questions about why we must import coal when we have our own, resources that we must invest in and everything. So for me, this is the double standard that African leaders are having. And if we are to commit to the loss and damage and indeed all climate agendas and agreements, then we have to be true custodians and actually commit. Development is expensive. Conservation is even more expensive, and if you want to limit emissions to 1.5, we have to do some sacrifices. And for me, I believe one of the sacrifices is discarding fossil fuels and rather investing more forward-faced technologies and models of development that do not necessarily deplete our only remaining natural world.
And yeah, the natural world, and that means we need to go green, invest in green energy. For the world to move, we need energy and power. But here's a case where if you want to invest into green energy and green power, it is dang expensive as we speak right now. So at COP, was this discussed, having access to cheaper green energy?
Actually, allow me to quickly take you back. Happened to be a project lead of the African Youth Caravan to COP27, and this was a mobilization of African youth to actually meaningfully support, build their capacity, and take at least 20 African youth from different countries to COP to send 3 key messages. One of them was on resilience, that we understand Africa is being called the most vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable continents, right? And it's bearing the worst impacts and the effects of the climate crisis. But at the same time, we are seeing communities in Africa adapting to the same impacts and actually creating more solutions and resiliency to deal with it and cope with these impacts. And for us, we believe this is a positive story that we had to take to COP, and we actually took it from across Africa. And the second one was on just energy transition, that for a continent that we are saying is the most youthful, with over 70% being youth, right? Yeah. We must discuss energy as a key component of our developmental agenda. So how do we ensure that actually, as we discuss energy, we have to place in or factor in the place of technology, the bit of climate finance specific for energy transitions, and of course the bit of opening conversations to be people-centric. I always say that, Dennis, I believe we come to a point where everything we are talking about is very egocentric, but we need to be more ecocentric. So how do we discuss energy transition in a very ecocentric way? How do we see nature and the natural world as a place for us to get from and give back more than you're taking from? And that is the conversation that we need to take on energy related topics. Of course, there's been a lot that have been discussed about, including climate and finance and technology transfer to ease the burden of investing in newer energy technologies. And I believe it's part of the loss and damage also talking about how do we ensure that the financing is helping communities in Africa and developing world to sort of like build technologies that will help us while the climate crisis is happening, but they'll build that cushioning mechanism for us to be able to live with the effects while building more resiliency for the future. And we're seeing it in Kenya and other African countries: wind power, geothermal, solar. Though it's a bit expensive, but I think we are getting there. And with a bit more of a push and a nudge, our African leaders, our Kenyan leaders can actually reap big by seeing the potential in energy and actually seeing it as a entry point to creating more jobs and livelihoods for our youth, for our farmers, and for our grassroots communities who are doing a lot to actually decentralize our power and to create more solutions for them in the energy sector. Because honestly, Dennis, I don't think every Kenyan has access to power and energy, and Kenyans are doing a lot, but the government can learn a lot and include us in the discussion to really ensure that energy talks center communities and they actually deliver at the community level.
And now let's talk about communities, specifically the youth. Back in COP27, the youth were literally on the streets saying, we want to be heard, we want a seat at the table. Yes. You were there, you are a youth, why you heard?
Denise, the youth voice have always been there across Africa. And I'll surprise you that we were actually, yes, on the street demanding for action, but we're also in the negotiation centers. Yes. We are in the side events. And for me, I believe I was heard. I believe youth in Africa and youth globally were heard. Why? Because the side events and the way they ordered and organized the sessions was very, for me, intentional. That we had all these thematic days from, Solutions Day to Energy Day to Youth Day to Transitions Day to Biodiversity Day. So clearly what you could see is that a well-planned agenda that is almost inclusive, and people get a chance to speak out their voices. And to me, the action was not happening in the negotiation rooms. The action was actually at the side events, the pavilions, where people were bringing the solutions, discussing them, and actually connecting their country delegations, regional delegations, to ensure that we sort of link policy negotiations with work on the ground. And this is what I believe made us get our voices heard.
And finally, as we just wrap up, the final question would be, President William Ruto is big on forest cover, 5 billion trees by 2032, and he's going to include the youth in helping this. Just paint a picture of how important forest cover is for us, and moving forward, how important is it for the young people, for the entire society that is Kenya, to just jump on this initiative and make sure that we achieve these goals by 2032?
I mean, it's super important for us to ensure a serene environment, and forests and ecosystems in their natural space are the best custodians and refuge we have to actually further protect and cushion us from worst effects of climate change. We've seen in Kenya how even this year the rainy seasons have been prolonged and delayed. So the question is, how do we ensure that through reforestation and restoration programs, we actually are working with our communities to see the importance of protection and restoration of ecosystems to benefit us directly through, of course, rain for agricultural production and other services that we need, but also to ensure that in the face of the climate crisis, we are helping to capture excess carbon from the atmosphere, create livelihoods for people, because right now we talk about carbon capture, and then there's a whole market around carbon credits. So how do we also market this in a way that youth will see the potential in planting and growing more forests? And of course, not like a single species plantation. Biodiversity is very key when it comes to restoration. And I think our president, who is already having a background in environment, should of course push for the agenda of restoration, but more from a biodiversity perspective. We are not just planting trees for the sake of planting trees. And again, restoration is not just a question of planting trees. We have grasslands, we have microbial biodiversity in our soils. So how do we ensure that even as we talk about our 10% forest cover, we have these different components being incorporated in the whole ecosystem and discussion, so that by the year 2030, even before, we actually have this 10% forest cover, over 10% national tree cover, and actually delivering for our livelihoods, for our communities, and for nature. Because remember, the loss and damage just not coming on a silver platter. You have to be responsible. You get the fund, but you show us what you are doing for it. Sustainable development means that communities are not left behind. So this whole agenda is good, but we need to work with young people. We already have programs that we're starting, and I need the government to see us as not just another empty lot that is loitering and making noise. That in fact, if we must be meaningfully involved, Dennis, we have to be part of the discussions, strategy, and implementation. And for us, implementation means don't just buy that seedling at 5 shillings. Youth have families to run, they have rent to pay, and they have many other costs to actually make in our country. So how do we also package it in a way that will not, I will not call it sexy, but cool for youth to actually engage in restoration? And in that way, I think we'll really achieve this with the support of the government and other stakeholders.
Kaluki Paul Mutuku, Executive Director, Kenya Environment Action Network, calling upon the government and all stakeholders, you and I, to just jump on the bandwagon, sell this message, and make sure that the world is greener. And as I keep on saying on this show, let's keep being green. My name is Dennis Asato. Many thanks for watching Planet Action. Tomorrow we do this again. Have yourselves an amazing night.